Hi and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to cover common essay mistakes found in student psychological essays as revealed by your markers. To do this I asked various academics what the most common mistakes they see in student work, and I compiled the best and most common ones noted into this top 5 list. In this video we'll also try to consider not only what these mistakes are, but also how you might avoid them in your work, which might help you achieve better grades in the long run. Before we get started, if you're new to the channel and you like this video, then do consider subscribing so you can stay up to date with the latest releases. One of the common issues that markers said they experience in student assignments is not being able to hear the student's voice. What is meant by this is that the essay is written in a way that it's unclear what the student actually thinks about the topic or what argument they are trying to make, and instead the essay reads in a fairly descriptive manner where information is covered but not necessarily in a way that provides insight into the writer's views. One reason this might sometimes occur in student work is because students lack the confidence in putting forward an argument and instead therefore prefer to write in a safer way where ideas and evidence from papers are just described. However, not trying to put forward your voice or your argument means it's often difficult as a marker to assess your critical skills like argumentation, evaluation and critical thinking, which are often outlined in the marking criteria for the highest grade boundaries. This therefore makes it harder for you to achieve the highest marks in your assignments. Additionally, students might often worry about being wrong in the sense that their marker might disagree with their opinion. However, this isn't really something you should worry about, because actually often it isn't really the case. Sure, as a marker, I often have my own personal view about the question and what I think, but my focus isn't on trying to see that parroted back to me in a student answer. It is not inherently the answer that I am examining, but the process in which a student seeks to support their answer. So for example, by using appropriate evidence to support their points. So for example, you could put forward an answer that I personally disagree with, but that doesn't matter if you've selected sensible evidence that attempts to support that answer. So always remember that it's the process in which you arrived at your answer that is the focus of marking. And if you don't actually attempt to provide a position in the first place, then examining that process is quite hard as a marker to examine and therefore can often limit you from achieving the highest possible marks in your assignment. So how can you try and ensure that you're making your voice heard and come through clear in your essay? Well, one thing you want to consider doing is adapting your writing style. Often students tend to write in a manner where they say he said or she said. For example, Milgram suggests that obedience to authority occurs because people undergo a process of the agentic shift. Or how about Orne and Holland argue that Milgram's experiment lacked realism and that participants did not really believe they were giving other people electric shocks. The problem with both these statements is that you're just saying what other people have put forward as answers, critiques, opinions, thoughts and ideas, but it's unclear where you stand on the subject. Do you agree with those opinions? Do you think that critique is valid? Do you believe that explanation is a good one? So a good habit instead is to make statements about things and avoid saying he said, she said, or he argued, she argued, he suggests, she suggests. This will help you allow your voice to come through more, and all you need to do is appropriately credit the researcher when you are borrowing their ideas. For example, we could change that last example we had to, while Milgram's work provides seemingly compelling evidence for how people obey authority, it could be argued that the experiment lacked realism and participants did not believe they were giving real electric shocks. And then we could appropriately credit Orne and Holland for that point. So generally, a good rule is that all citations are in brackets and that you don't lead into sentences with the citation or the author's name. If you start sentences with authors' names and citations, it's more likely your essay will come across as a bunch of ideas from others, not your own thoughts. The other tip to make sure that your voice is heard is to think about what it is that you want to argue, or looked at differently, what position you want to take up in relation to the essay question. When you know what you want to argue or what position you want to take, you should then try and make it explicitly clear to the reader early on and ensure therefore you're working towards supporting that position. Ensuring you carve out a position on the subject will also help you shift from just describing evidence, which is when your voice is not being heard, to using evidence, which will help your voice come through much clearer. This next tip requires me to let you in on a little secret. Most of your markers are not as smart as you might think. Sure, we might have fancy titles and perhaps several degrees, and sure, we might have some pretty considerable knowledge about a specific area of psychology, but that does not mean by extension that we find complexity easy to understand. We don't. For example, human behavior is complex. We can all agree on that. But our theories, concepts to explain human behavior are pretty rudimentary and simplistic. And often that's what science is about, turning fairly complex issues like human behavior into digestible and simple ideas. We might at times lose some of the important information by doing so, but it provides a simple way of understanding human behavior. So how does this all relate to essay writing? Well, every now and then, as markers, we come across an essay that's quite difficult to read. It uses very complex wordings, complex sentence structures, it layers concept on top of concept on top of concept, and ultimately just becomes very, very difficult to follow what is actually trying to be conveyed. Sometimes this might be a product of not knowing how to explain those ideas clearly. But every now and then, we have a student who maybe confesses that they believe making their answer more complex was actually what we were looking for. The reality is actually quite the opposite. You're often starting with something complex about humans, but the goal of your essay is to try and turn that complex idea into something simple and elegant to understand. And by extension, part of achieving that is to write your ideas in simple terms. So don't get fancy with your writing just for the sake of it, because you think it sounds more intelligent. Instead, select the way of explaining things that seems the simplest to convey the ideas that you want to speak about. The best essays I end up reading often are the ones that are actually quite simple and straightforward to read and understand. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, don't get out your thesaurus. Don't try and find the most exotic and complex word you can use to make your essay sound intelligent. It really doesn't help. Instead, pick language that is generally known and understood, and try and select the simplest way of explaining your ideas. This will help the reader follow the ideas you're trying to convey in your assignment. Secondly, use simple and short sentences. Assignments that include sentences that span several lines are often actually quite difficult to read. Often it's easier to read things that are broken up in a way that makes things easier to digest. So keep sentences as short as possible, and where appropriate, deal with one issue, one sentence at a time. And the same thing applies for paragraphs too. Don't try to deal with 3 or 4 different ideas in one paragraph. Like with the idea of sentences, long paragraphs just overload people with too much information, and by the time that paragraph ends, you really forgot how it began, or what it was meant to be arguing in the first place. Instead, use short paragraphs. Deal with one idea, explain it simply, and use research to support it. And then deal with the next point in a different paragraph. Another issue that commonly appears in essays is an assignment where the paragraphs are disjointed from each other. There's no obvious link between the ideas or paragraphs it contains, and overall the essay feels like a shopping list of ideas, rather than producing some sort of coherent narrative. Sometimes, I think this mistake is driven by a misunderstanding by students regarding what the goal of an assignment is, and that is a belief that essays are just about demonstrating your knowledge and understanding. Whilst part of that is true, certainly we want to see that you understand things. Writing essays is actually a lot more than just that. We aren't just interested in seeing that you can outline concepts and studies, but we're also interested in about how you use them to support positions, arguments, opinions, and so forth. And this fits into the overall structure of an essay, because what we want to see in an assignment is that it has a nice narrative, a clear flow, and a sense of direction. And so ideas in an essay need to be built on top of each other, connected in some way, and hopefully work towards a particular answer. So how do we do this? The most common mistake that I see is a paragraph that starts like another study or another factor. This often leads to a very list-like answer, and moreover doesn't give insight into actually what you want to say, which links back to the first mistake of this video, no clear voice. So try to avoid starting paragraphs in this way. Instead, You should try and set up paragraphs with a sense of intent, and ideally connect it from your previous paragraph. So always try and make sure the first sentence of every paragraph outlines an idea, which you can then unpack in the rest of that paragraph and consider providing supporting evidence for. Moreover, consider the order of information in your answer. Consider where the ideas you want to cover maybe logically connect to each other, or might provide a nice flow between the paragraphs. Is there a way that maybe you can try and link these paragraphs together, or link these ideas together? By trying to link these things together, you will produce a clearer narrative for the reader to follow. Paying attention to these ideas about linking paragraphs together to create a clearer narrative from start to finish will lead to a stronger essay that demonstrates stronger analytical skills that we're looking for in the higher categories of marking criteria. Now hold on. This may seem like a super obvious one, but a common mistake markers noted was the number of mistakes in referencing and writing that they see in student essays. It's important to note that before we go further on with this issue, that sometimes there might be understandable disability or dyslexia reasons for these mistakes. And typically your college or university will have procedures in place to identify students who might struggle with these components of essay writing, and that therefore their grading of their assignments does not consider these aspects. However, showing an ability to reference correctly and write free from error is really an important skill. Obviously your degree is not an English language one, but still being able to write clearly is an important component for a reader to understand your work. Reading psychology at times can be difficult, and this might be made more difficult when grammatical or spelling mistakes are included. Ultimately, you might understand what it is that you're saying, but the job of essay writing is to communicate that clearly in plain written English. If you include spelling errors or grammar mistakes, it threatens to lead to the possibility that your work becomes unclear to follow, and therefore it's harder for us as markers to verify your understanding. It's also sometimes amazing how small changes in grammar can change the entire meaning of a sentence. For example, let's eat grandma sounds like you'll be having a nice pleasant family meal. But if we drop that comma and said let's eat grandma, well, suddenly I hold concerns over your family dynamic and whether we should get the police involved. Another reason why it's important to minimize the number of referencing and writing errors in your answer is it reflects a sense of professionalism and care with your work. If an assignment is filled with numerous spelling mistakes, presentational issues, referencing errors, then it indicates that perhaps maybe there has not been so much great care put into the work, and that maybe the essay answer has been a bit rushed. Part of academic writing is being able to show attention to detail and provide a professional level of presentation. So what kind of tips can we do to overcome some of these issues? The first thing is you should make sure you always proof your work before you submit. And if you're already proofing your work, make sure you proof it twice. Double check your references. Double check your writing. Do you spot any mistakes? Particularly when it comes to referencing, it might take at first a long time to do this, to check over your references. But as you become more familiar with reading APA formatting, you will spot mistakes more quickly. Another useful tip is just to read your work out loud. By doing so, you might notice issues in your writing, where maybe there's clunky expression, awkward phrasing. If you use software like Microsoft Word, then often these include very handy grammar and spelling checkers. These grammar and spelling checkers often have more settings than what are turned on by default. So do look at the settings that you've got on your processor and whether you can turn on a more enhanced and comprehensive overview to your spelling and grammar. This will help you spot more mistakes in your work and therefore rectify more of these problems. Regarding referencing, there are some great resources out there for how to cite appropriately, but also there are some referencing managers like Mendeley that take a lot of the hard work out for you. And finally, don't fret if your work does include a few mistakes. No one expects perfection, and I've certainly submitted papers in the initial form that were not free from grammar or spelling errors. But the fewer you include, the easier it will be to read your assignment and for you to therefore convey your understanding to the reader. The final issue that markers often cited was that evaluation was rather superficial or vague. By superficial, what markers meant by this was that the evaluation was fairly generic or surface level. For example, they might merely denote issues with correlational designs, or issues with conducting lab experiments, like for example how they might lack ecological validity. You should try to avoid generic criticisms like this. A good way of knowing whether your criticism is generic or not is to consider whether you could have written this criticism in your previous assignment or could maybe be applied to a range of topics. If so, it probably doesn't offer too much value to the current question. Instead, you should try to select evaluation points that are more strongly connected to the subject matter or research area. For example, the essay question might concern a concept that is difficult to measure or empirically quantify. Or perhaps the current evidence could be explained by two different theories, and it's difficult to disentangle the two to know which one is a better explanation of the current phenomenon. That is not to say that you should avoid generic criticisms entirely. But if you're going to use them, at the very least try to go further than saying something like, this study lacks generalizability. Always make sure that you connect your evaluation to the question. Why is it important? Or how is it relevant or implicate on your argument? Or maybe does it affect how much we can really say that the argument you're putting forward in relation to the essay question has merit? There we have it. 5 common mistakes as revealed by your markers and how you might be able to rectify them in your work. If you like this video, then do give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel so you can keep up to date with the latest releases. If you have suggestions for videos, then do get in touch with us via Twitter, Instagram, or by Gmail. Until next time.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via Instagram, Twitter, or email. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!